ocean had always been a source of mystery and fascination for humanity. Its vast depths and unknown creatures had lured explorers and adventurers for centuries, and this time was no different. The salvage team led by Captain Jameson had embarked on a mission to recover a sunken ship that had gone down decades ago. The crew was made up of experienced divers, technicians, and marine biologists, who were excited to discover what secrets the deep ocean held. The journey to the salvage site was long and arduous, but the crew was well prepared. They had brought state-of-the-art equipment and technology to aid in their search, including remotely operated vehicles and sonar systems that could scan the ocean floor. As they neared the site, they could see the wreck of the ship in the distance, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had occurred all those years ago. The crew began their preparations for the dive, checking their equipment and running through safety protocols. The marine biologists were eager to study the unique ecosystem that had developed around the wreck. The ship had been carrying a cargo of rare and exotic marine life, and they hoped to discover new species and unlock the secrets of the deep. As they descended into the water, the team was struck by the eerie silence that surrounded them. The only sounds were the bubbling of their regulators and the distant hum of the ship's engines. The water was cold and dark, and the team relied on their underwater lights to guide them through the murky depths. As they approached the wreck, they could see that it was covered in rust and decay, but still intact. The team split up, with some members examining the exterior of the ship, while others entered through the hatch and explored the interior. It was a surreal experience, like stepping back in time to a bygone era. As they searched the ship, they discovered strange markings on the walls and floors, which they couldn't explain. The marine biologists found evidence of a thriving ecosystem, with fish and other marine life using the ship as a refuge. They even discovered a species of fish that had never been seen before, with glowing eyes and iridescent scales. The team worked tirelessly for several days, documenting their findings and recovering any valuable artifacts they could find. They had no idea that their presence was disturbing the delicate balance of the ecosystem they had discovered. Beneath the surface, a species of underwater creatures known as sea vampires had taken notice of their presence and were preparing to strike. Little did the crew know, their salvage operation had triggered an unexpected and terrifying chain of events. The sea vampires, a species of deep-sea creatures known for their ability to drain the blood of their prey, were disturbed by the team's presence. As the crew worked on the wreck, the sea vampires began to sense their movement and activity, and it wasn't long before they began their attack. The crew had no idea what was about to happen as they continued their work around the sunken ship. The marine biologists were conducting a survey of the surrounding area, while the divers were busy retrieving valuable artifacts from the wreck. Suddenly, they noticed something strange moving in the darkness around them. They couldn't see anything clearly, but they could feel a sense of unease. One of the divers noticed a shadow moving rapidly towards him. He tried to signal to his partner, but before he could react, the shadow was upon him. He felt a sharp pain in his leg and screamed into his regulator. His partner tried to help, but it was too late. The diver was being dragged down into the depths by an unseen force. The crew scrambled to help, but they were met with chaos and confusion. They could hear the diver screaming through their radios, but they couldn't locate him. Suddenly, the screams stopped, and there was only silence. The crew was shaken by what had just happened, and they knew they had to get out of the water as quickly as possible. As they made their way back to the surface, they noticed strange bite marks on the diver's leg, unlike anything they had ever seen before. The marine biologists immediately recognized the marks as the signature of the sea vampires, a species of underwater creatures known for their ability to drain their prey of blood. The crew was stunned. They had never heard of sea vampires before, and they had no idea how to defend themselves against such a threat. They quickly realized that their presence had disturbed the delicate balance of the underwater ecosystem, and they had unknowingly become a target for these creatures. The crew regrouped and decided to conduct a full investigation of the area. They set up cameras and sonar systems to monitor the activity around the wreck, hoping to gain a better understanding of the sea vampire's behavior. They also consulted with marine biologists and other experts to learn more about these mysterious creatures. As they analyzed the data, they noticed a pattern in the sea vampire's behavior. They seemed to be most active at night, attacking their prey under the cover of darkness. They also appeared to be attracted to light and movement, making the crew's work around the wreck even more dangerous. The crew knew they had to come up with a plan to protect themselves from the sea vampires. They began carrying weapons and other defensive equipment with them on their dives. They also started working in pairs, always keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. Despite their precautions, the sea vampires continued to attack. The crew members could hear the creatures moving around them in the darkness, their glowing eyes and razor-sharp teeth sending shivers down their spines. They knew that they were no match for these creatures, and they began to fear for their lives. The crew's encounter with the sea vampires had turned their salvage mission into a fight for survival. They had unwittingly stumbled upon a hidden world beneath the surface of the ocean, a world that was now hunting them. The crew was trapped, with no way to escape the creatures that lurked in the darkness. The crew knew that they were facing a deadly enemy in the sea vampires. They had already lost one member, and they were constantly under threat of attack. They had to come up with a plan to defend themselves and complete their mission. The crew members began to work in shifts, with half of them staying on the surface while the other half went down to work around the wreck. This way, they could keep a lookout for any signs of danger and quickly call for help if necessary. They also started using decoys to distract the sea vampires. They created fake lights and movement around the area to draw the creatures away from their actual work site. This bought them some time to retrieve valuable artifacts without being attacked. But the sea vampires were clever creatures, and they soon learned to distinguish between real and fake lights and movement. They began to ignore the decoys and focus their attacks on the crew members themselves. The crew realized that they needed a more permanent solution. They consulted with marine biologists and experts on underwater creatures to come up with a plan. After several discussions, they decided to create a barrier around the wreck to keep the sea vampires away. The crew used a combination of nets and electrified fences to create the barrier. They also installed underwater lights to discourage the sea vampires from approaching. The barrier was effective in keeping the creatures at bay, but it was not foolproof. The sea vampires were persistent, and they continued to find ways to attack the crew. The crew members were constantly on edge, never knowing when the sea vampires would strike. They had to be vigilant at all times, and they knew that even the slightest mistake could cost them their lives. One night, the crew was working around the wreck when they suddenly heard a loud noise. They turned to see one of the electrified fences had been breached, and the sea vampires were making their way through. The crew quickly mobilized, using their weapons to fend off the creatures. The sea vampires were fast and agile, making it difficult for the crew to defend themselves. The crew members fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. One of the crew members, a young woman named Emily, was caught off guard by a sea vampire and was dragged down into the darkness. The rest of the crew could hear her screams, but they knew they could not risk their own lives to try and save her. The crew was devastated by the loss of their friend, but they knew they had to continue their mission. They reinforced the barrier around the wreck, determined to protect themselves from the sea vampires. The crew's struggle against the sea vampires had become a grueling battle for survival. They were constantly on guard, never able to let their guard down. They had to rely on their wits and their weapons to stay alive. As the days went on, the crew began to feel like they were fighting a losing battle. They were exhausted and demoralized, and they knew that their chances of making it out alive were slim. But they refused to give up. They were determined to complete their mission and retrieve the valuable artifacts from the wreck. They knew that they had to face the sea vampires head-on if they were ever going to make it out alive. The crew had been working for several weeks, fighting off the sea vampires and trying to retrieve valuable artifacts from the sunken ship. They had made progress, but they were still far from completing their mission. One day, as the crew was working around the wreck, they noticed something strange. They saw a group of sea vampires swimming in a specific direction, as if they were heading towards something. The crew had never seen this behavior before and decided to investigate. They followed the sea vampires, keeping a safe distance. They noticed that the creatures were heading towards a deep, dark cave in the ocean floor. As they got closer, they could see that the cave was filled with a strange, glowing substance. The crew members knew they had stumbled upon something important. They decided to investigate further and sent a team of divers down to explore the cave. The divers descended into the dark abyss and swam towards the cave. As they approached, they could see that the glowing substance was coming from a cluster of strange, pulsating plants growing on the cave walls. As they swam deeper into the cave, they could see that it was teeming with sea vampires. The creatures were everywhere, darting in and out of the shadows. The divers knew they had to be careful, as any sudden movement could alert the sea vampires to their presence. The divers continued their exploration and soon discovered something even more disturbing. They found that the sea vampires had created a nesting ground in the cave. Dozens of vampire eggs were laid out in rows, ready to hatch. The crew realized that they had discovered the sea vampires' lair. They knew that if they could destroy the eggs, they could potentially eliminate the threat of the sea vampires once and for all. The crew quickly formulated a plan to destroy the eggs. They prepared explosive charges and placed them strategically around the cave, making sure to avoid any of the pulsating plants. As they were about to detonate the charges, they suddenly heard a loud noise. They turned to see that the sea vampires had discovered them and were attacking the divers. The crew members on the surface quickly mobilized, using their weapons to fend off the sea vampires. They knew they had to act fast, as the divers were in danger. The divers managed to fend off the sea vampires and complete the mission. They detonated the charges, destroying the vampire eggs and the lair. The sea vampires were effectively eliminated, and the crew members were able to retrieve the remaining artifacts from the wreck without further incident. The crew returned to the surface, exhausted but relieved. They had completed their mission and eliminated the threat of the sea vampires. They knew that they had been lucky to make it out alive, and they would never forget the horrors they had faced in the depths of the ocean. As they made their way back to shore, the crew members couldn't help but wonder what other creatures lay hidden in the depths of the ocean, waiting to be discovered. They knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that few people would ever get to experience. The crew had faced their worst fears and emerged victorious. They knew that they would never forget their encounter with the sea vampires and the horrors they had faced in the depths of the ocean. After weeks of intense and dangerous work, the crew of the salvage operation was finally ready to return home. They had faced numerous challenges and overcome them all, but they were all eager to get back to their families and loved ones. As they boarded the ship that would take them back to land, the crew members couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They had survived the horrors of the sea vampires and the dangers of working in the deep ocean. But they also knew that the experience had changed them. They had seen things that few people had seen before, and they had faced their deepest fears. They knew that they would never forget the lessons they had learned during their time at sea. As the ship set sail, the crew members began to relax and reflect on their experience. Some talked about the dangers they had faced and how lucky they were to make it out alive. Others shared stories about the artifacts they had recovered and the historical significance of their discovery. But there was also a sense of sadness among the crew. They knew that their time together was coming to an end, and they would soon be going their separate ways. They had formed a bond during their time at sea, and they knew that they would miss each other once they returned home. As they sailed towards the horizon, the crew members began to make plans for the future. Some talked about their next salvage operation, while others planned to take some time off and spend it with their families. But despite their plans, they all knew that their experience with the sea vampires had changed them forever. They had faced their worst fears and come out the other side stronger and more determined than ever. As they approached the shore, the crew members couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. They were looking forward to seeing their loved ones again and telling them about their incredible experience at sea. But they also knew that they would never forget the horrors they had faced and the lessons they had learned. They would carry those memories with them for the rest of their lives, and they knew that they would always be grateful for the opportunity to face their deepest fears and emerge victorious. As they stepped off the ship and onto dry land, the crew members looked back at the sea and smiled. They knew that they had accomplished something truly extraordinary, and they would always be proud of what they had achieved. After returning home from their salvage operation, the crew members began to notice strange things happening around them. At first, they thought it was just their imagination playing tricks on them, but soon they realized that something was seriously wrong. People in their hometown were disappearing without a trace, and there were reports of bloodless bodies washing up on the shore. The crew members knew exactly what was happening. The sea vampires had followed them home. At first, they tried to keep the knowledge to themselves, but soon it became clear that they had to act fast before the sea vampires caused any more harm. They gathered together and came up with a plan to stop the creatures from attacking their town. The crew members knew that the sea vampires were sensitive to light, so they set up powerful floodlights around the town. They also urged everyone to stay indoors after dark and to keep their windows and doors tightly shut. Despite their best efforts, the sea vampires continued to attack. They were relentless and seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. The crew members were at a loss. They had done everything they could, but the creatures just wouldn't stop. In a last-ditch effort to save their town, the crew members decided to take the fight to the sea vampires. They armed themselves with spears and harpoons and headed out to sea in search of the creatures. The battle was fierce and brutal. The sea vampires were powerful and fast, and they seemed to be impervious to the crew members' weapons. But the crew members refused to give up, and they fought with all their might. After hours of fighting, the crew members finally emerged victorious. They had managed to slay the sea vampires and protect their town from further harm. But the victory came at a great cost. Many of the crew members had been injured in the battle, and some had lost their lives. The town was in shambles, and the people were traumatized by the events that had unfolded. The crew members knew that they could never forget the horrors they had faced, but they also knew that they had done the right thing. They had risked their lives to protect their community, and they had emerged victorious. In the aftermath of the battle, the crew members were hailed as heroes. They were celebrated by the townspeople, and their bravery was remembered for generations to come. But for the crew members themselves, the experience was a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of great danger. They knew that they would never forget the lessons they had learned, and they would always be grateful for the opportunity to have faced their worst fears and emerge victorious.